The sound that first alerted the landlady wasn't a scream or a crash. It was the steady, unending hiss of a water tap left running for hours. Inside the bathroom of a modest New Jersey boarding house, a scene of quiet horror waited. A young woman, just 24 years old, lay submerged in the cold water of the tub, her head beneath the faucet. On a nearby chair, her clothes were folded with an almost chilling precision. A note sat on a small table, its shaky handwriting telling a story of despair and a life given up. To the world, it was a clear-cut tragedy. A troubled soul named O.C. Sneed had finally found a desperate peace. But for one man, the county physician who first examined the body, the scene wasn't one of tragedy, it was a stage. It was too neat, too perfect. And that raises the bone-chilling question we're here to answer today. If O.C. Sneed didn't write that note, who did? And if she didn't take her own life, who held her head beneath the water until it was over? Otelia Gilmer Sneed, known to all as Ose, was a ghost long before she died. She was the very picture of turn-of-the-century Southern beauty, delicate, with eyes that held a deep and searching sadness. For a brief, fleeting moment, she had a life of her own. She married a man she loved and gave birth to a daughter, a small flicker of warmth in what had been a cold and controlled existence. That little family was her world, her one chance at a life defined by her own choices and her own happiness. But O.C. was born into a dynasty in decay. Her mother, Caroline, and her two aunts, Virginia and Mary, were the last vestiges of a proud Virginia family whose fortunes had withered like autumn leaves. They lived on the edge of Appalachia, in a world where the memory of wealth was a heavier burden than poverty itself. They were women forged in the fires of Southern pride, a pride that could curdle into something monstrous when faced with the shame of destitution. They saw Oates's simple happiness not as a blessing, but as a betrayal of their ambitions. And so they began the slow, methodical work of dismantling her world. They were a trio of spiders, weaving a web of concern and manipulation around her. They convinced O.C. that her husband was unworthy, that motherhood was too great a strain for her delicate health. They pried her away from her husband, and then, most cruelly, from her own child. They moved her from city to city, a traveling invalid with no anchor and no friends, only her three ever-present caretakers. The true poison they fed her wasn't in a bottle, it was in their whispers. They told her she was sick, and so she was. They told her she was a burden, and so she became one. They told her she was fragile, and her spirit became as brittle as spun glass. They isolated her from anyone who might offer a kind word or a dissenting opinion, until their voices were the only ones she could hear. This was the world that was lost, not just the life of a 24-year-old woman, but the life she was never allowed to live. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage of family duty, a beautiful, gentle soul who was systematically broken down by the very women who should have protected her. The tragedy wasn't just what happened in that bathtub. It was the slow, deliberate murder of her spirit that had been going on for years. To the first officers on the scene, it looked like an open and shut case, a sad but simple story written in the objects left behind. The laudanum bottle, nearly empty, the drinking glass, and the note, the final desperate period on a life sentence of sorrow. The scene was a still life of despair, carefully arranged and presented. But it was that very care, that meticulous neatness, that began to unravel the whole story. Suicide is an act of chaos, a final, violent tearing of the soul. This was something else entirely. It was clean. It was orderly. It was a performance. Dr. William Mackenzie, the county physician, was a man who understood death. He'd seen it in all its forms, violent, peaceful, accidental, and self-inflicted. And as he stood in that cold, damp bathroom, his professional instincts were screaming that this was wrong. He noted the position of O.C.'s body, the lack of any real disarray. He looked at the neatly folded clothes on the chair. Who folds their clothes before drowning themselves? It was a small detail, but it was a crack in the story. a tiny fissure through which a horrifying truth would begin to seep. The true wilderness in this case wasn't a forest of trees, but a wilderness of lies. The clues weren't tracks in the mud, but inconsistencies in human behavior. The two elderly aunts, Virginia and Mary, were putting on a symphony of sorrow that somehow rang false. Their wails seemed rehearsed, their grief too theatrical for the quiet, grim reality of the room. Dr. Mackenzie watched them, and the cold knot of suspicion in his gut tightened. He sensed he was not in the presence of mourners, but of actors who had just finished their final scene. The bathroom offered no easy answers. Instead, it presented a series of unsettling questions. Why was the scene so pristine? Why did the women's grief feel so hollow? And most importantly, as doctor, Mackenzie looked at the shaky, uncertain script of the suicide note. He couldn't shake the feeling that O.C. Sneed was not the author of her own death. The room was silent now, the water turned off, but for the doctor, the air was thick with whispers of a crime too monstrous to yet be named. In any story like this, the first shadow of suspicion always falls on the husband. And O.C. Sneed had a husband, a man she had once loved, the father of her child, a man who had been systematically and surgically cut out of her life by her family. He was the outsider, the one person who stood to gain nothing from her death, but everything from her life. Yet in the twisted logic of a murder investigation, this made him the perfect first suspect. The story the family told was a compelling one. They painted a picture of a rough, unsuitable man, someone who wasn't worthy of their Virginian aristocracy. They had, in their telling, rescued Otzi from a disastrous marriage. They were protecting her. But the lawmen had to wonder, what does a man do when his wife and child are stolen from him? Does he walk away? Or does a deep and poisonous bitterness begin to take root in his soul? The motive was as old as the mountains themselves, a heart turned to stone by jealousy and rejection. The whispers would have started immediately. He couldn't have her, so he made sure no one else could either. Perhaps he had been trying to get her back, and in a final, desperate confrontation, his rage had boiled over. It was a simple, brutal explanation that made a certain kind of sense. He was the spurned lover, the classic villain in a tale of love gone wrong. Investigators would have looked into him, searching for any sign of instability, any threat he might have made. Every letter he sent, every desperate plea to see his own daughter would now be re-examined through a sinister lens. Was it the plea of a loving father, or the obsession of a stalker? The family's wall of silence would have ensured that every memory of him was tainted, every action twisted into something menacing. He was the easy answer, the convenient scapegoat whose presence allowed everyone to avoid looking at the far more unthinkable possibility waiting in the shadows. But the husband was a ghost, a convenient shadow to chase while the real danger sat knitting in the parlor. The most chilling twists in any story come not from an enemy at the gate, but from a traitor at the table. And in Otzi Sneed's life, the table was surrounded by her own blood. No one would ever suspect the very women who had sworn to protect her. Her mother, Caroline, her quiet aunt, Mary, and the undeniable center of their dark little universe, her other aunt, Virginia Wardlaw. Virginia was a woman carved from granite. A former headmistress of a prestigious school, she carried herself with an imperious authority that bent others to her will. She wasn't just the matriarch of the family, she was its absolute monarch. To be in her presence was to feel a quiet, terrifying gravity, a force that pulled you into her orbit and held you there. She was a woman of formidable intelligence, but her mind had turned inward, consumed by a single, poisonous obsession. The secret motive wasn't a crime of passion. It was the cold, chilling arithmetic of greed. The family's pride was all they had left, and it was a poor substitute for the wealth they'd lost. Otzi, in their eyes, was not a daughter or a niece. She was an asset, a walking, breathing vessel to be converted into cash. Over months, they had taken out more than a dozen life insurance policies on her, a web of future payments totaling over $32,000. In 1909, that wasn't just a fortune, it was a resurrection. It was the price of their beautiful, fragile Ossie, and a price they were more than willing to pay. Suddenly, every act of care they had shown her was cast in a sinister new light. Separating her from her husband wasn't protection, it was isolating the asset. Moving her from town to town wasn't for her health, it was to keep her away from prying eyes. Their constant whispers that she was sick and tired of living weren't words of comfort. They were psychological warfare, preparing the ground for the suicide they were planning. Their grief, which had seemed so theatrical to the doctor, was now revealed for what it was: the final, triumphant act of a play they had been writing for years. But there was a third player in this tragedy, a silent partner whose motives were not born of passion or family pride, but of cold, impersonal commerce. This threat didn't come from the shadowed hollows of Virginia, but from the gleaming office buildings of the North. It was the burgeoning, rapacious world of the life insurance industry. In the early 1900s, this was a new and powerful game in America, a system that allowed you to place a wager on a human life and, for the right price, profit from its end. This was not a single man in a city suit, but an army of them. Eager agents, hungry for commissions, who saw these three refined Southern ladies not as potential killers, but as a respectable source of income. They likely never questioned why this family was so keen on insuring their frail, sickly niece. They never raised an eyebrow as one policy was stacked upon another, and then another, until Ossie Sneed's life was worth a king's ransom. Why would they? The premiums were being paid, and that's all that mattered. This external force provided the ultimate impersonal motive. To the insurance companies, Ossie was not a woman with hopes and a lost child. She was Policy 74B, a name on a ledger, a set of actuarial tables, a risk to be calculated. The system itself, in its relentless pursuit of profit, created the very weapon the family needed. It transformed Ossie from a human being into a financial instrument, an investment waiting to mature. This corporate entity created a climate of deadly opportunity. It gave Virginia Wardlaw the tools and the incentive to turn her dark thoughts into a workable plan. The insurance men didn't hold Ossie's head under the water, and they bore her no ill will. But their contracts, signed and sealed with a fountain pen, were the death warrant. They were the faceless, unknowing accomplices who built the gallows, handed over the rope, and then turned a blind eye, content to simply count their money. The law, my friends, tends to move in straight lines, and the straightest line of suspicion pointed directly at Ossie's estranged husband. In the days following the discovery, the telegram wires began to hum with his name. Here was a man with a clear, understandable motive: the rage of a spurned husband and a father denied his child. A posse, either literal or figurative, was sent to track him down. They expected to find a monster consumed by rage. Instead, they found a man hollowed out by loss. The promising trail evaporated into a puff of cold Appalachian air. Ossie's husband was hundreds of miles away, his presence confirmed by a dozen clock-punching factory workers who saw him every single day. His alibi wasn't just firm, it was ironclad. When questioned, his grief was raw and undeniable. The letters he'd sent, once viewed as the obsessive rantings of a potential killer, were now revealed for what they were: the desperate, heartbroken pleas of a man trying to claw his way back to the family that had been stolen from him. The lead wasn't just cold, it was a dead end that led to another victim of the family's cruelty. With their primary suspect cleared, the investigators in New Jersey hit a wall. They were left with the unsettling scene in the bathroom and three grieving women. But how do you accuse a mother and her sisters of such an unspeakable act? Virginia, Caroline, and Mary presented a united front of Southern gentility and profound sorrow. Their story was simple and, on the surface, unshakable. Ossie was a troubled soul, and her fragile mind had finally broken. Who could prove otherwise? The investigation stalled. The days turned into weeks. The initial shock in the community began to curdle into a low-grade fear. The easy answer, the vengeful husband, was gone. Now, a more terrifying question hung in the air. If he didn't do it, who did? The authorities were frustrated, circling a truth they couldn't grasp. They had a strong suspicion, a gut feeling that the evil they were looking for was right in front of them, hiding behind black mourning veils, but they had no proof. The case was growing colder by the day, threatening to become just another sad, unsolved tragedy. The investigators soon discovered that the most formidable obstacle they faced wasn't the lack of evidence, but the suspects themselves. The community in this case wasn't a town or a holler. It was a closed, suffocating circle of 3 women. The Sneed and Wardlaw sisters had built a fortress around their secret, and its walls were mortared with Southern pride and a deep, ingrained contempt for the prying questions of outsiders. This wasn't the code of silence of the mountains where neighbors protect their own. This was the omerta of the family, a pact sealed in blood and greed. At the center of this wall was Virginia Wardlaw. Her iron will was the law that governed her sisters. Caroline, Osie's own mother, and the quieter Mary moved in her shadow, their thoughts and actions seemingly extensions of Virginia's own. To question one was to question them all, and to question them was to be met with a performance of wounded dignity and sorrow so convincing it was almost a work of art. They were a united front of black lace and quiet denial, a living embodiment of the Southern creed to never air one's dirty laundry in public, especially not for the benefit of Northern lawmen. Their silence was rooted in a profound arrogance. They believed they were intellectually and socially superior to the policemen and reporters who hounded them. The investigation, in their eyes, wasn't a righteous search for truth. It was a vulgar intrusion. They answered questions with condescending patience, as if explaining complex matters to a simple child. Every inquiry about Otes's life was met with a polished story of a tragic, depressive girl. Every query about their own actions was deflected with a sigh of grief. The psychological toll of this siege was immense, but it only seemed to harden their resolve. Interrogating them was like trying to punch through granite with your bare hands. There were no cracks, no whispers, no single moment of weakness. One sister's story perfectly mirrored the others. The pressure built, but the wall held firm. This steadfast, unified front created a profound fear in the investigation itself. The fear that these women, protected by their class, their gender, and their own unshakable will, might actually get away with it. They were hiding in plain sight, and their silence was the most damning evidence of all. The case, which had gone cold, was not broken open by a single dramatic discovery. There was no hidden diary, no deathbed confession. Instead, the truth was unearthed by a new kind of detective, the kind Virginia Wardlaw and her sisters had never accounted for, the insurance investigator. These were not men bound by the niceties of police work. They were bulldogs, hired to protect their company's money, and they followed the scent of fraud with a relentless, single-minded determination. While the police were hitting the wall of the family's silence, these investigators were working in the opposite direction. They started not with the body in the tub, but with the paper trail. They descended on the case like a flock of crows, pulling records, interviewing agents, and piecing together the web of policies the family had spun around Otse. What they found was staggering. It wasn't just 1 or 2 policies, but more than a dozen, a financial net so vast and so recently woven that it screamed of a premeditated plan. The turning point came when they uncovered the timing. They found that in the weeks leading up to Otes's death, the sisters had been in a frantic race against time. Some of the premiums were overdue. The policies, worth a small fortune, were on the verge of lapsing. The investigators found evidence of desperate letters, of money being scraped together, of a panicked effort to keep their investment alive. It was the crucial detail that changed everything. Otes's death wasn't just a convenience. It had become a necessity, a deadline that had to be met before the whole scheme collapsed. But the final forgotten clue was found not in a ledger, but on a druggist's shelf. An investigator, working on a hunch, canvassed the pharmacies in the towns the women had passed through. And he found him, a small-town druggist who remembered a strange purchase. A tall, stern-looking woman, a woman who matched Virginia Wardlaw's description perfectly, had come in just days before the death. She'd bought a bottle of chloroform, claiming it was for a sick cat. Suddenly, the official story of a laudanum suicide crumbled to dust. A new, far more horrifying picture began to form. A picture of a young woman not just drowned, but first subdued, rendered helpless before being placed in her own watery grave. The truth was no longer a suspicion. It had a name and it smelled of chloroform. With the discovery of the chloroform purchase and the frantic, desperate attempts to keep the insurance policies active, the story of Otzi Sneed's sad suicide was no longer just a lie. It was an insult to the truth. The net, woven from paper trails and a druggist's memory, had been thrown. Now it was being pulled tight, and there were only 3 people caught within its threads. The investigators were no longer asking if a crime had been committed. They were looking at the 3 women in black and asking a much more terrifying question: which one of you held her down? The unmasking began with the undeniable architect of the entire affair, Virginia Wardlaw. She was the sun around which her sister's weaker wills orbited. It was her stern, imperious face the druggist remembered. It was her sharp, calculating mind that had conceived of the insurance scheme, first tested on her own nephew Fletcher, and now perfected on her niece. The motive was born of her pride, her refusal to accept a life of genteel poverty. In the family's fall from grace, she saw not misfortune, but a personal failure that had to be rectified by any means necessary. Otzi was simply the final, most valuable means. But Virginia, for all her strength, did not act alone. She needed accomplices, and she found them in her own blood. Her sister, Mary Sneed, quieter and more pliable, followed her lead without question. But the most monstrous betrayal came from Caroline Martin, Otzi's own mother. This was the dark heart of the conspiracy. Caroline, a woman who seemed cold and detached, had made a horrific choice. She had sided with her powerful sister against her own child, sacrificing her daughter on the altar of her family's financial salvation. She was not a mother watching a tragedy unfold. She was a willing participant, a silent partner in what the sensationalist press would soon call the Bathtub Trust. And so, the true motive was laid bare, and it was far colder and more brutal than any crime of passion. It wasn't mercy, it wasn't madness, it was an act of accounting. They had convinced themselves that their right to a comfortable life superseded Otzi's right to live at all. They were drowning in debt and shame, and Otzi was a life raft they could only use by killing her. The love, the care, the concern, it was all a ghastly performance, a long and patient grooming of their victim for the final slaughter. The mask was off. Beneath the veils of southern gentility and grieving motherhood lay the faces of killers. They weren't monsters who had crept in from the wilderness. They were the monsters who had lived inside the house all along. The central mystery was solved. Otzi Sneed was murdered by her mother and her aunts, a conspiracy of 3 women bound by blood, who committed the ultimate sacrilege for $32,000. The plan, rehearsed for weeks in whispers and cold glances, was now set in motion. In the confines of that small boarding house room, the air grew thick with a terrible purpose. A handkerchief was produced, its clean white fabric belying the dark intent. The sickly sweet odor of chloroform filled the air, a chemical scent that promised not a gentle sleep, but a deep and final oblivion. Otzi's faint pleas, already weakened by years of psychological torment, faded into a confused murmur, then silence. There was no longer any resistance, only the dead weight of a life already surrendered. 2 sets of shadows moved as one. The sound of her body meeting the cold, hard porcelain of the empty tub was a dull, final punctuation mark in the quiet room. Then, a hand, perhaps the very hand that had once rocked her cradle, reached out with unnatural steadiness and twisted the silver faucet. The shriek of the pipes and the sudden roar of rushing water was a deafening sound, a sound meant to wash away everything. For a moment, there was a brief, violent disturbance on the surface of the rising water. A frantic splash, a single desperate gasp for air that was immediately swallowed by the deluge. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The splashing stopped. The only sound left was the steady, indifferent hiss of the water pouring over a stillness it had just created. Her dark hair began to spread out around her head like a tragic halo in the ever-deepening pool. The women watched, their faces unreadable stone, until the surface was calm and glassy. This was not an act of rage, it was a task to be completed. With a chilling efficiency, they turned their attention to the stagecraft. They placed the forged note just so. They arranged the laudanum bottle and the glass, and with methodical care, one of them folded Osie's clothes and placed them neatly on a chair, the final sociopathic touch on their masterpiece of murder. With the evidence mounting, the veneer of Southern respectability shattered like cheap glass. Virginia Wardlaw and Caroline Martin were arrested, their black mourning dresses replaced by the coarse fabric of prison uniforms. The trial became a national sensation. Newspaper reporters from across the country descended on the small New Jersey town, eager to document every detail of the Bathtub Trust. The courtroom was packed every day with a morbidly curious public, all craning their necks to get a look at the mother and aunt accused of a crime that defied comprehension. Caroline Martin, Osie's mother, seemed to shrink in the witness box. Her lawyers argued that she was not a monster, but a victim herself, a woman completely under the hypnotic spell of her domineering older sister. They painted a picture of a weak will eroded by a stronger one, claiming she was insane, incapable of distinguishing right from wrong under Virginia's powerful influence. Some in the courtroom pitied her. Others saw a coward trying to escape the consequences of her own terrible choices. But Virginia Wardlaw was a different matter entirely. Even in her jail cell, her indomitable will refused to be broken by others. She would author her own ending. Realizing the game was over and the full, sordid truth of their years of scheming was about to be laid bare for the world to see, she chose the final act of control. With a small, sharp pen, the same kind of instrument she might have once used to grade school papers, she wrote out a full confession. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, taking sole blame, exonerating her sisters, and framing the murder as a mercy killing for a girl who was tired of living. Then, with a surgeon's precision, she severed an artery in her arm and bled to death on the cold stone floor of her cell. Virginia's suicide note was her last, defiant move on the chessboard, and it worked. It cast enough doubt to save her sisters from the gallows. Caroline Martin was found guilty, but her plea of insanity was accepted. She was sentenced not to prison, but to 7 years in the New Jersey State Hospital for the insane. Mary Sneed, the quiet third sister, was also declared insane and institutionalized. Justice, in the end, was a murky affair. The mastermind was dead by her own hand, and her accomplices were hidden away from the world in asylums, leaving a verdict that felt profoundly unfinished, a story that still echoes with the injustice of it all. The ripples from that cold New Jersey bathtub spread far and wide, altering the course of every life the water had touched. For Osie's husband and her young daughter, the verdict was not a victory, but the beginning of a long, quiet haunting. He was a man vindicated, cleared of all suspicion, but his reputation in some circles remained unfairly stained. He was left to raise a daughter who would never know her mother, a child whose inheritance was not money, but a legacy of horror, a bedtime story too terrible to ever tell. They disappeared from the public record, seeking the anonymity that had been stolen from them, forever defined by a tragedy they had no part in creating. The families of the guilty were likewise shattered. The proud Wardlaw and Sneed names, once synonymous with Virginian aristocracy, were now whispered with a shudder, forever linked to a monstrous crime. Descendants for generations to come would carry the weight of what their forebears had done. They bore a silent shame, a darkness in their family tree that could never be pruned away. They lived with the knowledge that the blood of both a victim and her killers flowed through their own veins. And what of the women in the asylum? For Caroline Martin, the mother who sold her daughter's life, the state hospital became her tomb. She died there just a few years later, in 1913, her claims of insanity perhaps becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in the grim reality of institutional life. Did she ever feel remorse? Did she see her daughter's face in the long, lonely nights? The asylum walls kept her secrets. Mary Sneed, the quiet accomplice, faded even deeper into obscurity, a footnote in her sister's grand, evil design, living out her days in the shadow of a crime that had consumed them all. The fortune they had killed for was eaten up by legal fees and clawed back by the insurance companies. In the end, their great scheme earned them nothing but death, madness, and infamy. If you travel to the old cemeteries of Lynchburg, Virginia, you can still find the stones that mark the end of this story. There, under the shade of ancient magnolias, lies the grave of O.C. Sneed. And not far away, you will find the final resting places of her mother and her aunts. They are all there together, a family united in death as they were in life, a silent, chilling tableau of victim and killers sharing the same sacred ground. The physical evidence of this tragedy has not vanished. It is carved in granite, a permanent record for anyone who knows where to look. But the story doesn't just live in stone, it breathes in the folklore of the region. For years after the trial, the people of Lynchburg spoke of the Wardlaws and the Sneeds in hushed tones, as if saying the name too loudly might invite the same darkness into their own homes. They spoke of a curse, a poison that ran through the family's bloodline. The convenient suicides of Colonel Sneed and O.C.'s brother Fletcher, followed by O.C.'s murder and Virginia's own final, violent act. It was too much to be a coincidence. It was the story of a doomed house, a family that was destined to consume itself. To explain the unthinkable, to understand how a mother could participate in the destruction of her own daughter, the most powerful legend of all was born, the myth of Virginia Wardlaw, the hypnotist. People whispered that her will was more than just strong. It was a supernatural force. They said she could bend people to her will with a glance, that her sisters were not truly accomplices, but puppets dancing on her invisible strings. It was a story that painted Virginia not just as a murderer, but as a sorceress of the mind, a Svengali in a Sunday dress. And of course, where there is great tragedy, there are always ghosts. Legends began to circulate of a weeping woman heard near the site of the old New Jersey boarding house. And back in the Lynchburg cemeteries, people claimed to see a sad, spectral figure in a white dress wandering among the tombstones on moonless nights. The lost soul of O.C. Sneed, forever trapped by her family's evil, unable to find peace even in the grave. These tales, passed down through generations, are the scar tissue left on the memory of a community that was forced to look into the face of an unimaginable evil. We began this story in a cold bathroom, with a still body in a tub and a simple, terrible question. If O.C. Sneed didn't take her own life, who did? We now have our answer, and it is more horrifying than any fiction. The hands that held her head beneath the water were not those of a stranger or a spurned lover or a faceless villain. They belonged to her mother and her aunts. The plot to end her life was not hatched in a dark alley, but in the parlors and boarding house rooms where they feigned love and affection. The story of O.C. Sneed is not just a tale of a forgotten crime. It is a chilling lesson on the nature of greed. It shows us how the desperate hunger for money and status can become a kind of poison, a sickness that rots a family from the inside out until it is capable of devouring its own. It's a brutal reminder that the most respectable exteriors, the southern manners, the church-going piety, the black mourning dresses, can hide a heart of pure, cold stone. But the ultimate moral of this story is about the perversion of trust. Osi was taught her entire life to obey her family, to trust in their wisdom, to believe in their love. That trust was the weapon they used against her. They turned the sacred bond between a mother and a child into a tool for manipulation and murder. This is the story's final, enduring horror, the realization that the greatest danger doesn't always come from the darkness outside, but from the smiling faces we are taught to love unconditionally. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. It stands as a testament to the fact that monsters are real, and sometimes they're the ones who tuck you into bed at night.